Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Josephine Johnson, and I'm a member of the board of the American Insurance Trust, known to most of you simply as the Trust. We're delighted that you're able to join us today for the fourth and final part of our four-part series, We Hold These Truths, Perspectives on Health Disparities, Racial Identities, and Cultural Humility. Now, a little bit about myself. In addition to being a member of the Trust Board, I have a private practice in Livonia, Michigan, where I provide services to children, adults, and families. I have a master's degree in school psychology and a doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Detroit. I chaired APA's task force on implementing the Multicultural Guidelines, and I'm currently co-authoring a monograph on multicultural therapy. It is our honor to make a land acknowledgement. Indigenous communities have lived in and worked through the places in which we all sit over hundreds of generations. As guests, we recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. We wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of those communities, and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. Today's webinar, Cultural Humility, an Ethical Imperative, is being presented by Drs. Miguel Gallardo and Tema Bryant-Davis. I want to tell you what makes them experts in this field. Dr. Gallardo is a professor of psychology and program director of Aliento, the Center for Latinx Communities at Pepperdine University. He is a licensed clinical psychologist and maintains an independent consultation practice at the Neurobehavioral Clinical and Counseling Center, where he conducts therapy, assessment, and consults with organizations and universities on developing culturally responsive systems. He teaches courses on advocacy, multicultural and social justice, and professional practice issues. He has published refereed journal articles, books, and book chapters in the areas of multicultural psychology, Latinx psychology, ethics and evidence-based practices, cultural humility, and racial colorblindness. He also has a cultural humility podcast. Dr. Bryant-Davis is a licensed psychologist, professor of psychology at Pepperdine University, and director of the Culture and Trauma Research Lab. She is a past psychology representative to the United Nations and a past president of the Society for the Psychology of Women. Dr. Bryant-Davis has published and presented on the cultural context of trauma recovery, including the societal trauma of racism. She is author of the book, Thriving in the Wake of Trauma, a Multicultural Guide, and editor of the book, Multicultural Feminist Therapy, Helping Adolescent Girls of Color to Thrive. In 2020, the International Division of APA honored her for contributions to the psychological study of women and gender with a focus on Africa and the African diaspora. We are fortunate to have both of them with us today. We also need to let you know that all of our presenters have declared that they have no conflicts of interest. And finally, here are our learning objectives. Participants will be able to differentiate the concepts of cultural competence and cultural humility, identify how cultural humility should be considered an ethical imperative, describe the ways to incorporate cultural humility into various areas of psychological practice. Now, let us hear from our experts, beginning with Dr. Gallardo.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, and particularly to share the space with Dr. Bryant Davis, who I'm fortunate to be colleagues with her at Pepperdine University, and so I get to spend time with her in different ways. More than just an hour together here today. So this is a treat for me as well. I appreciate the invitation to talk about this particular these ideas, if you will, and why this is so important for our work and moving forward. I think we could argue that these, from my perspective, I think from our perspectives, these issues and thinking about the notion of cultural humility and what that looks like in our work and what it means to be an anti-racist practitioner and to fight against isms and all those kinds of things, I think one could argue have always been important. I think even more so now, we're really being presented with, I think, a lot of challenging scenarios that are forcing us to look at ourselves as human beings, but also the work that we do as psychologists. And I've said this before. I've said this actually for years now, but I think no one's better prepared to address the issues facing the challenges in our society better than we are as psychologists. And I continue to believe that and continue to think we can play a critical role in addressing some of the most challenging issues that we're being presented with today. If we go to the next slide, Karen, thank you. So I think it's important when I think of the concept of cultural humility, we're going to talk about it from an academic perspective and how it's been defined in the literature to a certain degree. But I also think about just, on a humanistic level, why it matters so much and sort of remind us this idea of what does it mean to be human. And when I think about this concept of cultural humility, I sort of center myself on our humanity and what that means, particularly at this moment in time. I was listening to a journalist who's been around for a very long time, and he's covered a lot of different eras in our country's history. And he said that this is probably the most divided and divisive he has seen our country since the Civil War, and I think that means something. That's saying a lot. And so when I think about what it means to be human at this point, I'm always reminded of Aristotle, who I always refer back to. And Aristotle, believed that we as humans are political animals, and so there's a lot of different interpretations of that and ways of understanding that. I think the one that really resonates for me, and I think for many others as well, is not necessarily, defining political in terms of, who's red, who's blue, who's Republican, who's liberal, conservative, whatever it may be, Trump supporters, non-Trump supporters, Biden supporters, non-Biden supporters, but more thinking about that it is impossible for us as human beings to remove ourselves from the context in which we find ourselves, which our lives unfold, which our work unfolds in many ways, in which the work of those who we're serving really demonstrates and determines oftentimes what life can look like for many of the folks that we're serving, particularly underserved and unserved communities. And so this idea of being a political animal as humans is this notion that if you're a human being, you're political. We are political. If you're a psychologist, I'm going to make a big assumption here that you're also a human being, and therefore you are political. And so I think there's this argument for, in everything that we do, we need to carry our degrees in one hand and the most recent news issue in the other, local, state, and federal news issue in the other, in many ways, to help us inform our work in many ways. And so our professional knowledge and expertise in our roles as psychologists, they do not eliminate us from being influenced by the things that matter to us most, our lived experiences, social statuses, privileges of personal identities. I've always found it really interesting when psychologists tell me that our involvement in those quote unquote social issues is not our responsibility. I continue to hear that and continue to be challenged by that when I hear psychologists say that, and folks continue to believe that there's a separation of who we are as professionals from the realities that exist in the world around us. And so we are embedded within communities and contexts that are deeply influencing and impacting how we see ourselves, how we see others, how we respond, how we may not respond. So I want to sort of frame that for us a little bit. So I think it's important for us to combine our commitments and obligations as professionals with our commitments and obligations as citizens in society. I think that's as relevant and critical today as it ever has been. And so I worry a little bit that we have left our sort of social commitments and responsibilities to society at large, at the door, and then we enter our offices and enter our workspaces, and so we neutrality is not serving us well, and I think we need to think about how we can reshift and reimagine and recreate what it means to be a psychologist moving forward. Next slide, Karen. So, I mentioned this. I worry a little bit about when folks tell me that these social issues, which I just really think is human lived experience issues, are not our place. That concerns me. John Carlson, colleague who unfortunately passed away several years ago, one of the last things he wrote was that our new charge must be to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And so, I think one of my glass is always half full and not half empty. So when I think about everything that we're going through today in the world, I think, we're sort of being poked and prodded. We're being charged and challenged in a way to try to think about how to do things differently moving forward, and how to do our work differently in some ways. And so what I really I think valued in all the struggle and the unrest and the discourses that we're having at this moment in time is that there are more people today than before who are being poked and prodded, and who are feeling uncomfortable, and who are being afflicted by what's happening, and trying to do something differently moving forward. And I think that's a positive. And so I think, and I've seen a lot of psychologists really be moved and pulled in that direction to do something, and really respond in ways in their professional roles that maybe they just didn't do before. And so I think that's a really positive. So I think in our attempts to comfort the afflicted, those of us who sit comfortably need to be challenged at times, and really pulled in different directions. And so Bill Doherty, which I think really this comment really resonates, I think, with this particular topic we're talking about today, is our task is to be citizen therapist, and what does that mean for us, and what does that look like for us? And he said that all clinical problems treated by therapists are thoroughly interconnected with larger public issues, but the public dimensions of psychological problems and the civic action that could be appropriate to take don't appear in our treatment manuals, and are oftentimes kind of second-class interventions in many ways, and not that first point of intervention. I always tell folks, let's find out what's right with people before we try to figure out what's wrong with them, no matter who they are and where they come from. And so, I practice and do individual work. I do the community work, et cetera. So when I make this next comment, it's not that I'm invalidating the individual work that we're doing, but I have to sort of challenge us to think about, if we're solely only intervening at the individual level, while knowing that many of the issues that our clients are bringing to our offices, whatever those offices may be and wherever they're situated, are thoroughly situated and layered within communities and context, and are derived and developed within the public socio-political and socio-cultural context in which we find ourselves. I have to ask, how much are we doing at times? What might we be missing at times? And I think therein lies part of our challenge as we move forward. Next slide, Karen. So just quickly, where are we today? I don't think I have to say too much about this. We're being, there's a lot of suffering happening. There's a lot of trauma happening. I'm glad Dr. Bryant Davis is here with me today as a trauma expert to sort of illustrate some of that in some of her comments. But there's trauma. People are being traumatized, re-traumatized, and that is impacting deeply, our overall psychological and physical well-being. And so we're being challenged by trying to confront these issues. Next slide, Karen. So what I want to say about that, though, is that if we think about, I think what's really important as we think about our roles as providers, as psychologists, is that I think sometimes And I know that there's a lot of isms that exist in the world and that are very present and that are interconnected with each other. And so to address one and without the other, we have to be mindful of how we're sort of simultaneously addressing these multiple isms and layers of identities, social identities that people have. I want to focus just a minute on racism, because I think we've not done enough with that, and I think we are being called to do a lot with that at this moment in time, which is a good thing. But my concern is that when we focus on like the Black Lives Matter movement only, or a George Floyd, people seeing George Floyd being suffocated and ultimately dying, or people hearing of another Black or brown body being assaulted or being murdered in whatever capacity that may be. It's too easy, I think, for folks to sort of think about those as isolated incidents, or incidents that only happen over here, or incidents that that aren't part of the everyday infrastructure of society, and how our society is sustaining and perpetuating the continuation of these behaviors and these responses and these reactions at times to Black, Indigenous, people of color. And so by focusing only on those overt, those big moments in time, if you will, those overt things that we're seeing that are right before us that we can't help but see, I think only focusing on those, I think, misguides us a little bit. It legitimizes an erroneous conceptualization of racism. It doesn't allow us to see that racism exists in everyday life. It gives us this false notion that America's, here in the United States, that we're no longer a racist society, because those are isolated incidents. And I think it doesn't allow us to conceive of racism as systemic, embedded in everything that we do. And when we focus on those overt actions, it falsely, in some ways, gives us this narrative that it's about good versus bad people, the racist versus the non-racist. And I want to just quickly say something about an op-ed that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar wrote in the Los Angeles Times after George Floyd was killed. And what Kareem Abdul-Jabbar said is, he says, racism is like dust in the air. Until you shine the light on it, you have no idea how much it's always there until we shine light on it. So in other words, those dust particles, they always exist. We just can't see them. Racism is like the air that we breathe in society. If we are not actively working against it, then we are passively contributing to and sustaining and maintaining the exact thing that maybe some of us are trying to avoid. I think some of the most dangerous situations and circumstances are folks who don't believe they're participating in these processes, maybe unconsciously, unknowingly, and believe that they're not racist, that they're not sexist, they're not homophobic, whatever the ism may be. And I think that's our challenge. How do we help people understand that if we're not actively working against it, that we might be passively participating in maintaining and sustaining these issues? And I think because of that, we need to do a self-examination as psychologists when we're responding to the needs of Black, Indigenous, people of color. Okay, Karen.
Thank you so much for opening us up, setting the context for this work. I'm so honored that the Trust issued this invitation, and thank you, Dr. Gallardo. It is wonderful to present with you, and he will be back with us. I appreciate you naming the reality of trauma, because it is important to us to really name what is the context in which we are even doing this training. And I am mindful that many times we are helping our clients through traumas from a relatively stable place. But what it means, as so many of you are on the front lines as it relates to mental health, trying to provide services while people are affected by the global pandemic, by the trauma of oppression, and while you as well, as the clinician, as the psychologist, are also holding those realities for yourself and for your loved ones. And so while we are here in all these little boxes, I know there are many stories and lives that are represented in each box, and I appreciate your presence. So as we think about honing in on cultural humility, it is important to acknowledge cultural competence. And there are many great theorists and practitioners who have done groundbreaking work and foundational work in cultural competence. And it is often defined as awareness, knowledge, and skills. And so the awareness starts with self-awareness in terms of each of us being cultural beings. And so sometimes we want to skip to the other. You know, we want to workshop about how to work with this group and how to work with that group, but can be uncomfortable owning our own identity, owning the ways that we hold privilege or power. And so cultural competence starts really with that self-awareness of being able to recognize, even when we are in the majority, that identity exists, right? That it matters, that it shows up in various ways. And then there is knowledge for us to really understand the history and contemporary reality of various communities. And if we are honest and mindful, if we're willing to be critical of our school education, whether you grew up in public school or private school, many times what we were given in those classrooms is a very limited version of history. When you think about, if you can go back that far, depending on our ages, you know, who you were presented with as the great inventors, the great minds of science, even who you were told were the great minds of psychology, and who was present on that list and who was not present. And so for us to be knowledgeable about both the history as it relates to traumas, but also being aware of communities' contributions and resilience and brilliance. And then we also are mindful about skills when we think about emotional intelligence and the importance of being aware of not only what we speak, but our nonverbals and communications. One research study that looked at interracial dyads having a dialogue, and afterwards they would rate their experience with the dialogue, and the ratings were very different for the white person in the dyad and the Black Indigenous person of color. And so they wanted to drill down to figure out how do we understand this disparity? And when they asked people to describe how they came up with their rating for how the exchange went, the majority of the white participants made the rating based on the verbal content, what was said. And the majority of the people of color said they came up with their rating based on body language, facial expression, eye contact. So when we think about skills, it is not only about what we say in the room, what questions we ask, but also our posture, our tone, our connection. The key we know, right, is rapport building. And so what is the relationship we have established or have not established? As I know many feel the pressure of intake, of let's ask all these super personal questions and then we'll build the relationship later. But when you are dealing with communities that have been disrespected, have been dishonored, that relationship from the very beginning, really from the first phone call, is so critical. So cultural competence, a lot of work has been done in that area, but there has also been some critique of cultural competence. And one aspect of critique is the word competence. So some people have pushed back because they notice when we say the word competent, that some people will go to one workshop like this one, or they'll read one book. And we saw this summer, all the top books on the various booksellers were books about racism and anti-racism. So sometimes people would get one CEU or read one book and say, okay, I did it, I'm culturally competent. And it doesn't really grasp the reality of needing a stance of humility and that it's lifelong learning. So at Pepperdine, I teach our multicultural class, and yet I am continuously learning. And so if we just embrace this notion of I'm competent, what often it can support is a certain arrogance. And when we are arrogant, we are unteachable. And so then it becomes hard for us to learn from our clients, hard for us to learn from our colleagues. So sometimes even in these spaces, people will come in very defensive. very guarded, very argumentative, kind of prepared for battle. And so we want to really reflect on ourselves about what would it mean to have an openness, to have a curiosity, to have a desire to learn about people's experience instead of assuming they must be exaggerating, or I already know, or I don't like their agenda, as opposed to the idea of really trying to come in from a place of self-reflection, self-critique, being willing and open to learn, and continuously assessing the dynamics in the relationship, right? In the therapeutic relationship. And so that is what cultural humility is. It's not just like that I already know, like I learned these 10 facts about each group, so now I know them. And as I say that, I'm reminded of when I was in graduate school, and I loved my program, but the class on family therapy, we had one article of the whole semester that was on Black families, and it was called The Poor Black Family. That was the name of the article. And so it was, for that whole hour, everyone was saying the poor Black family, the poor Black family, poor Black family. So you can come out of that thinking, I already learned about them. I know how to work with the quote, poor Black family. And so we really want to shift out of that and be motivated for continuous learning, to be mindful of power, of privilege, and of oppression. Often it is easier for us to acknowledge the ways in which we we are marginalized, but it is difficult for us to sit with the ways in which we have power and privilege. So I encourage you to continue to monitor that within yourself so that we can be open to the experiences, the very real lived experiences of other people. Next slide. And then we want to consider intersectional cultural humility. So intersectionality, which is a term that Kimberly Crenshaw developed, is not just having multiple identities, but it's when people are members of multiple marginalized groups. So then you think about, what is the experience to be LGBTQ and Asian American as we're going through this COVID-19 experience? What is the experience of someone living with a disability and who is also impoverished? And so the multiple ways in which people can be marginalized can affect even their experience. So it reminds us to not, what people would say, essentialize, where you don't recognize the variety that exists even within communities and groups, based on our lived experience. So one example is even gendered racism. So how is racism experienced or directed or targeted towards women of color versus men of color versus persons who are gender nonconforming? And so we want to recognize the complexity of culture, so that also will keep us humble because there is still consistently so much to learn. So we look at the sociocultural factors, the impact within social institutions of who is at the table and who is not at the table, who has voice and who is silenced. And so we try to shift past assumptions to really be open to meet the people who are in front of us and to also be tuned in to our own experiences. Next slide.
Okay, I'm back. Thanks, Dr. Bryant Davis. I'm gonna, I know we have limited time today, so I'm gonna move through these, and cover the most important aspects of these slides. You have these slides before you and are accessible to you, so you can read them in more detail later. But I want to kind of bring our work a little bit back to the ethics conversation and human rights, if we can. Karen, can you go to the next slide, please? So, one of the things when I think about ethics and ethics codes and what all that sort of comes together when we think about our work as psychologists, I'm always mindful that, if I look at iterations of the ethics codes, 10, 20, 30 years ago and look at where we are today and the continued reiterations that are happening with the ethics codes, they have evolved. The codes have evolved. Our ethics guidelines and codes are evolving. but I worry that their application and the way that we continue to interpret our ethics codes reflects a more sort of past and narrow and outdated mindset that may impact how we view our work and in what capacity we view our work to intervene, to build respectful relationships, to be, culturally humble in our work in those ways. And so I think, this is where I believe that good, well-intentioned practitioners and psychologists may unintentionally violate their clients at times for fear of engaging in doing the wrong thing, making the wrong decision. And certainly, I have never advocated for unethical behavior. And I sat on the California Board of Psychology for 6 years, and nobody ever got their licenses restricted or taken away for accepting I don't know, an orange juice or a taco from a client. Melba Vasquez says sometimes the taco is just a taco. We don't have to break it down and sort of decide what it is and where it was made and how it was made. And so I think we I want to plant some seeds, and we want to plant some seeds that you'll hopefully continue to water and really nurture along the way. And so ethics codes cannot be read and understood acontextually. If we go back to where we started around, our being political animals, and the everything that our clients are bringing to us is socially derived and produced. The social, historical, political context all need to be considered, and when we think about what it means to be good ethical psychologists in our work. And so the question I think we have to ask ourselves is, what does it mean to do no harm? I've never advocated that our ethics codes and DSM and all these things need to be out and done with and not a part of our work. I think it's around how do we start with a culturally centered frame, lens, multiple lens in which we look at these and interpret and understand the ethics codes, the DSM, et cetera. And that changes, I think, how we apply those concepts, the content, the guidelines, the codes, et cetera, in our work on a daily, weekly basis. Next slide, Karen. So, anytime we talk about these issues, social justice, social issues, human rights, and ethical practice, there are a lot of folks that, have argued that psychology doesn't have a place in these issues, which I'm going to come back to. I mentioned that already, and I'm going to come back to it again. But I think that when we talk about the ethics codes, a lot of people would argue that our ethical guidelines and codes are in place to protect the client. And I think, while I'd like to believe that's true and that's the case, and I think that is the intent, I oftentimes worry that when we are confronted as practitioners, as psychologists, with situations that are maybe unclear, a little bit blurry, in terms of therapeutic situations, I think we might rely on the ethics codes and guidelines as a measure of self-protection over what's in the best interest in serving our clients at times. And I worry about that. And so I think the question we have to always ask ourselves is, who and what are we serving? Who and what are we protecting? And I worry sometimes, and again, this is, most of what I say is not an either or, but a both and, but I worry sometimes that we are protecting and serving a traditional system of care, a traditional way of thinking about delivering care, and more so than thinking about who sits before us and the issues that are being presented before us. And so I think a question we have to ask ourselves in every situation is, who and what are we protecting and serving? And I worry sometimes that it's not always in the best interest of those that we're working with, but more the systems in which we exist in, and protecting those, and even sometimes our own work. And I understand that as someone who practices independently, I get that. I understand that very well. Dr. Bryant Davis also practices independently. So it's not that's not understood. It's more around trying to just sort of shift a little bit around how we think about that, particularly at this moment in time moving forward. So one of the things I'm always concerned about is a lot of times folks are recruited for their skill sets and where they come from and who they are ethnically and racially. And then we silence them by not letting them do the work that they think is important to be done with the communities who we think need the services the most. And again, what are we protecting? What system are we protecting at that moment in time? Are we protecting a systemic racist system? Are we protecting a culturally bound way of delivering services that hasn't always reflected Black, Indigenous, people of color's worldviews, ways of living, ways of negotiating the world, et cetera? And I worry a little bit about that. Next slide, Karen. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about these because we have these accessible to us. Principle D, justice. Principle C, fidelity, and really thinking about our roles in contributing to fairness and justice and to all people, and to the benefit from our knowledge and contributions in psychology. And so we have to be aware, as Dr. Brian Davis said, of our own biases, our limitations in the work that we do. I worry sometimes too that we tell everybody that you need to do X, Y, and Z, but I'm not so sure that we're always preparing folks to be able to do that work. So it's like there's been mandates for decades now. We got to be multiculturally competent. We got to integrate it in the curriculum. We have to, all these have tos, and as Ellis would say, we're shitting all over ourselves in some ways, and we're not necessarily, I don't think, adequately preparing people to do the work that they need to do when it's all said and done. And so we have to, I think, even shift our preparation and how we're training and preparing folks to do the work, even those of us who've been out for a while who maybe didn't have that training. Next slide, Karen. We also have a set of multicultural guidelines. I'm hoping that that you're familiar with the multicultural guidelines that were revisited again and updated in 2017. And guideline 5 in the multicultural guidelines talks about, everything that Dr. Brian Davidson and I've been talking about, recognizing historical and contemporary experiences with power, privilege, oppression, and how we, as such, we have to seek to address those institutional barriers, inequalities, disproportionalities, disparities in our criminal justice system, educational system, our mental health system. Sometimes we're reinforcing our mental health status quo that the sole bearer of responsibility for what an individual or family or couple may be going through solely resides within themselves, when at the same time we know that the context, the circumstances, the systems in which we exist in absolutely matter in how we understand ourselves, understand what we're experiencing, the challenges we might be experiencing, and particularly for Black, Indigenous, people of color. And then we have our ethical principles, that I'm hoping all of you are familiar with around, principle A, D, and E. Who does our work benefit? How do we do no harm? How do we ensure justice for all, which I just mentioned, and respect people's rights and dignities. And so there's a call, there's a charge for us to do this. Next slide, Karen. I want to just go down to just say a quick on this side because I'm aware of time. But there's people who I mentioned who critique the use of psychological science to address oppressive systems and state that it politicizes the profession. When I was CPA president, we got pushback when we were asked to sign an amicus brief supporting same-sex marriage in the state of California. And psychologists at that time were upset with me as president and with the organization and whatnot. And so it sort of this, there's this historical belief that the field is apolitical, and it's not. Psychology has had and continues to play a role in influencing, social policies and practices. The first APA president, G. Stanley Hall, was made decisions at that time around, withholding civil rights for African Americans on the grounds of their sexual impulses, and that it arrested, African Americans' development and throughout the rest of their life. And then that's one end of the spectrum. The other end, doctors Clark and Clark, in their testimony on desegregation of schools and Brown versus the Board of Education. So we are not apolitical. We actually we have been very involved and continue to be. Those are just two examples. And while the impact was very different, that speaks to the power of our roles and responsibilities as psychologists. Next slide, Karen. And just really briefly, so that this, Melton has a great article around what it means to be an ally, an activist, and an advocate. And, many of the things that we've already talked about, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about those issues, but really highlighting our own self-reflection, really being strategic in choosing activities and what it means to be an ally, to engage in activism and to do advocacy work. And then holding ourselves and our colleagues accountable when we see people doing things that are maybe not okay, which continues to happen. And then obviously, Dr. Bryant Davis mentioned this self-care. Next slide. Okay.
So we want to think about how this shows up in therapy. Next slide. What you want to really consider is cultural opportunities. There are moments that come up in session. The first, of course, is during the intake when I'm trying to get a sense of who this person is. And most of us now do a trauma history inventory. Most of us ask about substance use, but many of us still do not ask about experiences of discrimination, of bias, of oppression. And so really taking the opportunity in the beginning and throughout sessions as we are listening to people's narratives to get curious about, open to the fact that we are affected by our contextual realities. And it also is really important that we get comfortable with these conversations. I often think about with our graduate students, if they do kind of on the master's level, 1 unit or 2 units on human sexuality, often they're not comfortable with the dialogue, so they avoid it. And then directly or indirectly, we communicate to the clients that it is a topic to avoid. And so to really intentionally practice, to lean into being more comfortable talking about people's experiences with discrimination, with racism, with heterosexism. Next slide. So you want to begin to ask questions without judgment, so being mindful about our tone and assumptions, expressing some level of understanding and appreciation, which means doing our research outside of session. While we learn from our clients, it is also important that we care enough about their religious and spiritual traditions, about their gender identity, about their race, that we go out and get information so we show up being equipped in some ways while we are continuing to be open to learn. Also being transparent about what we don't know. The worst thing we can do is talk to people as if we know what they're talking about when we clearly do not. And so people can appreciate our honesty of even asking the question, can you tell me about that? Or I'm not familiar with that. We also, as Dr. Gallardo mentioned, we want to have a strengths-based approach where we don't just look at a group as deserving of our pity or we just feel bad for them, but we recognize people come with cultural resources. So there is more to race than racism. There is more to sexuality than heterosexism. And so to really create space for the breadth and the depth of people's cultural experiences and being mindful not to avoid the discussions, but really to engage. Next slide. It also requires our self-reflection. In this qualitative study noticed, one of the psychologists in a qualitative study said that a number of her Chinese clients were terminating prematurely. And many times we are quick to say that people are resistant to care, or they're not engaged, or they're not invested in their wellness. And we rarely really reflect on, maybe I was boring. Maybe there was a rupture that I never addressed. Maybe I was insensitive. So for us to be tuned in, as this one participant noticed, once they started framing things from the standpoint of the family and not just the individual, there was more engagement. Next slide. and learning how to follow the client's lead. Often we come in with this agenda that we're the expert on how to deal with your anxiety or your depression, but when we do not really leave room for us co-creating the agenda and co-creating the therapeutic goals, we can miss a lot of really important parts of a person's life. Next slide. And so we want to explore not only ethnicity, but intersectionality, being aware of colorism, that oftentimes ethnic minorities who are of a lighter complexion are treated better in the general public, and then even within their communities, being aware of religion and spirituality, being aware of people engaging in indigenous healing practices. Psychology is relatively young. So what is it that communities have done to heal? And do those practices still benefit them, and can we integrate them? Next slide. With mindfulness and other interventions, we want to be sensitive to who we're introducing the intervention to. So it should not be a cookie cutter approach, but if I'm introducing mindfulness to a Christian client, if I'm introducing it to an ethnic minority, that what does it mean for me to invite them into silence? What does it mean for me to invite them into stillness? And to recognize for oppressed people, the invitation for stillness is a radical revolutionary act to say we don't have to constantly be busy proving ourselves. Next slide. We also want to reflect on our sessions, our own sessions, and also when we're in supervision. As you're listening to those recordings, what was the comfort level? In what ways was I comfortable or not comfortable? In what ways was I respectful? Was there anything I said or did that could have been seen as disrespectful or that came off from like a place of arrogance or superiority, so that we can learn from that and show up with more humility and openness. Next slide. A caution for Black, Indigenous people of color who are psychologists is often these trainings have an assumption that we're talking to white people about how to work with people of color. But I just want to name the challenge when you're a person of color working with a white client, if that white client is uncomfortable working with you. And so that it is not just about erasing yourself and saying that that's what it means to be professional, but that you get to be a human being in the experience and to show up with that gives knowledge and wisdom what your experience is in the room. And so it is not a one-size-fits-all approach. Next slide. When you're doing supervision, we want to be mindful for our trainees that we are sensitive to their experience, not only as clinicians, but what has been their experience going through life in the bodies, the skin, the identity they're in. And our final slide, as we turn to prepare for question and answers, is that we want to not only go with knowledge, we don't want to just go with humility, but we want to think about liberation psychology, which is being actively anti-oppression, but it is instead really about helping people fully realize their lives and being tuned into social justice being an important component for our wellness. Thank you so much. We'll take your questions.
It's not surprising that we have a number of questions and very exciting ones, and so I'll have to be selective. Unfortunately, we won't get to them all, but to begin, one question says, how do we deal with our countertransference when treating patients who may be racist and toward whom we may have tremendous difficulty?
This is a great question. And I think sometimes we misunderstand what it means to have positive regard for our clients. And so some people will think, well, since I'm supposed to have positive regard for them, I should not have any opinion about them making racist or oppressive statements. And so what you need to ask yourself is, do you think it's healthy? Do you believe it is healthy for people to go through their lives holding racism? Because if I do not believe it's healthy, then it's not about it's my agenda, right? It is if I hear a client say anything that they could be talking about their mother, they could talk about their job, they could talk about finances. And if I understand that what they are saying is harmful, not only to other people, but also to them, how it affects you to have to walk through life fearful and hate and carrying hatred for people, then it is important for me not to just think that's my problem that I need to silence, but that in service of this person, we need to create a safe place to be able to dialogue about it.
Yeah.
That is very akin to another question, which asks, do we have a responsibility as therapists to intentionally attempt to move a client away from a racist perspective?
I'll start with this, and then Dr. Brian Davis can chime in if you want to. You know, I always, you know, just sort of continue what Dr. Brian Davis said. I always think about, you know, what they're presenting to me and how it's connected to their larger social network, relationships with others, presenting concerns. And so, you know, if someone's, you know, making a racist comment or demonstrates racism in some form or another, I'm connecting that to, you know, this person's overall wholeness and wellness. I liked what Dr. Brian said around, you know, if we pull it on ourselves, in some ways, we're perpetuating and sustaining the status quo in many ways. And so I have to sort of understand what I'm responding to, but also keep some distance from that and remain and thinking about what is this serve for this person, and how is this person being challenged by this. And so if I think about it from those perspectives, I do believe it's important for me to reflect and respond and provide feedback at times to clients when maybe they're engaging in a way of thinking or behaving in ways that may not be so helpful. So I use myself as part of that. It's like, you know, we have to think about it. We're getting a sort of more refined and clean version oftentimes of what people, how they are out in the world. And so I think it's important to address it. Absolutely.
And I just want to piggyback on that to say, people assume silence is agreement. So if I have a client, you know, who they, you know, assume that I am Black American. And so if they come in and start ranting about immigrants and start talking really negatively about all these Latinos are terrible, and if I just write in my pad and say, that is agreement. And so my silence is not neutrality. It is communicating something. So we want to be careful about assuming our silence is neutral.
That's right.
Thank you. Dr. Gallardo, can you elaborate on the slide that implies if we are reacting in a culturally appropriate manner, we need not temper our actions to be consistent with ethics codes?
Okay. So you know, I'm trying to remember what slide that was actually.
I think they're probably talking about having a taco is a taco, maybe.
Oh, you know, so Joe, Dr. Johnson, can you give me the question one more time? One more time, if you would.
Again, I'm not sure that it connects exactly with the slide, but the idea is, can you elaborate on the idea of reacting in a culturally appropriate manner kind of moves us away from having to be consistent with ethics codes?
Well, if I said that and implied that, that wasn't the intent. In fact, I think it's quite the opposite. I feel like we when we are sort of centering our work with those with whom we're serving, I think when we ask ourselves, is this in the best interest of those that we're serving? I think that very much is in line with our ethical obligation and keeping doing our work with integrity. My concern is that when we automatically assume that something isn't possible, or we automatically think that we shouldn't do something, or there's going to be a problem if we, you know, accept the taco, you know, whatever it is. That's my concern. Because I think in those situations, sometimes it might actually be unethical and clinically not indicated in the most helpful way for what we're trying to do to serve those clients. And so it's not that I'm suggesting that, you know, that we're being unethical. In fact, it's quite the opposite. I think we need to be more mindful about you know, how we're thinking about responding at times, and really seeing that as what's in the best interest of those who we're serving.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I think we have time for a couple more. How can we shift training at both the graduate and postgraduate levels to help providers unlearn behaviors and attitudes that might be harmful?
I think a part of the training is looking at our syllabus and looking at what we are assigning in terms of readings. So if you're teaching and all of the articles are by cisgender straight white men, you may be missing some important contributions to the literature. Like the literature is there. There are people who have done this work, and that often we train the way we were trained.
Mhm.
So I think it first requires that humility of like, maybe there's some things I didn't get. And so I would then have to go learn them so that I can share them with our students. And so that we then present it with the humility of recognizing there are multiple approaches, not only cultural modifications of treatment, but there are also treatments, practices that emerge from cultural groups themselves, right, that have created their own practices. And
Mhm.
so for us to be open to those instead of this rigid idea that only this way, only this theoretical orientation works. And I just want to say, I saw someone ask a question what I meant by essentializing. And
Yes.
that just means when you think because someone is a part of a race, that all of these attributes are applied to them. So
Mhm.
for example, people of color endorse higher religiosity, but not all people of color are religious. So that's what it means.
Mhm.
Very good. Now, I want to offer you an opportunity to respond to a comment which says, I have asked my state to have a requirement for courses on cultural competency, now cultural humility, but this hasn't happened yet.
That's terrible. We're actually, you know, we actually just did that here in California. It's in process in California. Some other states have done as well. I mean, I just think it's you know, we're if we're truly so boards are in the job of protecting consumers. We are consumers as psychologists, and those who we're serving are consumers, and so we're ill-equipping, and we're not really protecting consumers if we're not creating pathways and and opportunities for people to be better prepared to address the needs of underserved and unserved communities. It's just we're both doing ourselves a disservice and those who we're serving if we don't do that better.